So I like to think of the session as looking or taking a longer look at the overlooked, or maybe taking a different look at some topics that have already been in circulation, either locally or further afield in curatorial discourse and art history. Okay, so we will begin with Marie Matrère, who will discuss the new analyst group formed in Beijing in 1988 and examine their distinctive art by instruction approach. Megan Williams will follow with a presentation that documents and historicizes the work and activity of Bay Area curator, critic, and activist Adrienne Fusé in the 1990s and 2000s. The third presentation will be delivered by Marion Cousin, who will look at artistic constructions and reconstructions of war events produced from 2001 to the present by Walid Rad and Omar Fast. And finally, last but not least, Lauren O'Connell's presentation will depart from a study of the archive of San Francisco-based artist David Ireland at 500 Cap Street, and argues for the significance of the house, or his house, as being central to his overall artistic practice. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Marie Matrère.
Hi, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming this afternoon to listen to our presentations. My name is Marie Matrère, and I'm here to present my thesis entitled Analysis, Negating the Individual in the Interaction-Based Practice of the New Analyst Group in Beijing, China, from 1988 to 1995. The end of the Cultural Revolution and economic and social reforms of the late 1970s had many consequences in mainland China, especially on the art scene. Artists witnessed the introduction of literature, philosophy, and art styles from the West, occurring through reproduction, exhibitions, and publication. The formation of small collectives was also a common practice at the time. These groups stimulated individual artistic explorations and allowed artists to benefit from the safety and unity of groups against possible state repression. In this context, the artists Wang Luyang and Gu Denqing began collaborating in Beijing in 1987. Joined by artist Chen Xiaoping within a year, the trio formed the New Analyst Group, or Xinkedu Group in Chinese, in 1988, which I will refer to from now on as a New Analyst. This group approach to making artworks was distinctive. Active until 1995, they based their practice on a series of collective instruction, which they would execute to create artworks. To do so, the three members followed specific protocols of execution. First, the members had to unanimously agree upon an instruction before implementing it. Then, each member, in turn, performed the instruction until the last command was executed. Finally, the resulting drawings would appear in different forms, such as tables, diagrams, and numbers, which were then bound into books for presentation in an exhibition context. For the New Analyst, the work's meaning resided in the creative process of production, rather than in the reception of a finished object, whether by the art market or general audiences. During that 8-year practice, the New Analysts participated in numerous high-profile exhibitions of Chinese contemporary art locally and internationally, such as China's New Art post-1989 in Hong Kong in 1993, or Configura 2, Dialogues of Culture in Germany in 1995. Despite these involvements, few in-depth writing about their works has been produced over the years, and even less so in English. Additionally, little primary documentation of their practice remains today, possibly due to the fact that the artists destroyed their own archive in 1995 when they disbanded. Then, now, almost 20 years after the New Analyst's deliberate dissolution, I argue here that their distinctive collective approach to art making, when based on instruction, eclipsed the artist's individual identity. By extension, this process offered a critique of the individual artist as an instrument for institutions such as the market or state, among others. While studying the new analyst practice specifically, I would like today to also address the meaning, range, and scope of instruction art internationally. Indeed, this genre still lacks comprehensive critical analysis and scholarships, despite a long tradition in the West since at least the late 1960s with the advent of conceptual art. In this presentation, I will compare the new analyst practice with the curatorial project Do It, pulling out examples from each. Initiated in 1993 by curator Hans-Ulrich Obrist and artists Christian Butonsky and Bertrand Lavier, and still in operation today, Do It comprises an exhibition series featuring artworks created according to artists' instruction. Then, these instructions are enacted by museum or gallery staff, as well as audience members to create physical artworks in the gallery space. Since the project has traveled to more than 50 venues worldwide since its beginning, including the web, many individuals have realized these works. Though very different, both the new analyst art and Do It raises questions related to the status of instruction art and of the authorship or authority of individual artists. Both involve the production and circulation of books. Here, I'd like to discuss both in order to open up authorship, authority, and instruction art for examination. For each iteration of Do It, according to its rule, each host venue selects at least 15 artists to make instructional works and then releases them. In addition, each host commissions local artists to create other instruction, which will also be realized by museum staff or audience member. Typically, Do It instruction texts are concise and direct, and they address audience members and museum staff directly with using the pronoun you. For instance, in 2012, to create a geometrical color painting, artist Ethel Ednon instructing reader to, quote, with your pencil, draw a grid. Let's say 9 meter squares by 9 meter squares, 81 squares in all of equal size, unquote. There, as you can see, the imperative tense, the use of the pronoun you, and the simplicity of instructions seem to instantly create a closeness between artist and reader, possibly suggesting a blurred hierarchy between them. As museum employees and community members actually make these artworks, their interpretation of instruction and their subjectivity play a significant role. Such collaboration introduces indeterminacy into the production of physical artworks, and as far as the curator and organizers are concerned, this process is functionally equivalent to chance. Moreover, the artists and the people who carry out the artist's instructions are necessary for the realization of an artwork, implying that they are on the same level. Chance relates to the tradition of instruction art by the conceptual avant-garde in the 1960s and later on in the West. For instance, American artist George Brecht's book, A Box, entitled Water Jam, produced between 1959 and 1966, included instruction for the creation of objects or tableaux. The obscure instruction left almost all the choices of making to the realizer. One could perhaps then argue that the audience that realizes instructional work could be considered artists if they perform this instruction, according to their own subjective interpretation. And in the same way, Do It suggests that everyone could perhaps be an artist by performing this direction. A few years before Do It launch, the new analysts on the other side of the world in China, their approach to instruction sharply contrasted. Although they employed rules for making artwork, they hardly allowed outside participants to create pieces on their own, such that their instructions were addressed to the artists themselves. First, they created instruction that included complex details as well as a technical geometrical vocabulary to describe the different elements in the work. For instance, the new analysts began Analysis 5 in 1995 by describing the creation of a grid, or field A, as they designate it, through a detailed explanation. Quote, the field A, whose point of origin is O, consists of a series of squares that are the result of the intersection of vertical and horizontal lines whose labels are the letters of the Catalan alphabet, unquote. A calculation of the numbers of letters in the Catalan alphabet indicates that the grid contains 26 lines and columns. By soliciting a calculation to understand the action to be performed, the first instruction then also possibly deterred audience members from pursuing the experiment themselves. By contrast, artist Etel Adnan using simple vocabulary to order the reader maker to draw 81 square grid. Second, the new analysis experiment relied on intricate rules consisting of allocating details of images or words from text into consecutive boxes of a grid. But they never mention why they choose this specific visual as points of departure. For instance, part 1 of the book, Analysis 5, consisted of distributing one by one into a grid the words of 2 texts. These 2 writings were the introduction and the curatorial essay of the exhibition Out of the Middle Kingdom, Chinese Avant-Garde Art, exhibited in Barcelona in 1995 and in which the new analysts participated. The 2 preliminary texts whose selection process remains obscure, representing the primary material of group experiments. Then, given these details, it would be surprising to find other participants interested in enacting the instruction of the new analyst. The collaboration is non-existent between them and other participants, rejecting perhaps the parallel between artists and audiences suggested by Do It. Despite 2 different approaches to the role of the audience, both the new analyst and the artist of Do It seem to channel this notion of rational art into the processes of art making. So then, I asked myself, looking at these 2 projects, where is the art in art by instruction? Because from this first analysis, you can think that maybe both of the projects, even if one is artistic and the other curatorial, actually think that the art is in the performative process of making art. But maybe it's in the idea behind this direction, or in the instructions themselves, or the final artworks that result from this instruction, or maybe into the book that assembled them. Maybe it's in everything, actually. I'm going now to look specifically at the role of the book medium in both the new analyst experiments and in and in Do It exhibition series. Contrary to the Do It catalogs, the analysis book series included visual illustration of the implementation of an instruction. Each page included plates that illustrated one step of this process. Consequently, by turning the pages, and on the screen you can see 4 of the pages of their last book, the one before the last one that they produced. By turning the pages, readers could witness the creation of the work, step by step. The visual outcome of the last instruction also appeared in the book, but no different was introduced in the layout of the page, such as a caption, for instance. The book is then used as a way to feature or document and emphasize the process of artistic production. Do It approach to the book differs from the new analyst. First, the publication rarely include installation shots of photographs of the created artworks, such that documentation of these works lives mainly online today. Second, circulating from one institution to the next, Do It books all include participants' artist names and their instruction, but they never include the names of people who made the artworks, perhaps by the virtue of the impossibility of doing so. Nevertheless, the prevalence of the rules and artists over visual results in the catalogs imply that the artist is exclusively the originator of the instruction, not the person who performs it. This non-recognition of the work's maker is noteworthy, for it places the collaboration between artists and audiences in the background. In doing so, one might then argue that the Do It books contradict the project's initial theoretical premise that everyone could be an artist. From this discussion on books, it is also possible to learn something about the status of the art in instructional work. If do it validates the status of instruction as art, then it also unilaterally suggests that in art by instruction, the art lies only in the instruction. In fact, this rules out the consideration of the production process. This vision designates the individual artist as the unique author of both the instruction and its physical implementation, echoing the status of instruction art in the 1970s, mainly in the West. Then, two factors led to the proliferation of instruction art. First, individual conceptual artists found a way to emphasize ideas in their work rather than the creation of visual forms. Second, in the 1970s, creators of large international shows, such as 955,000, created by Lucy Lippard, asked for pieces that could not be shipped or produced in distant venues. And so some of these artists design written instruction for other person to create their works instead. Through their instruction-based production previously described, the new analysts also established themselves as the unique authors and artists of their works. However, they promoted their authorship as a collaborative art group, not as three individual artists working together yet separately. In doing so, the new analysts distanced their practice from a collective of individuals who worked independently under the same umbrella. In China, this distance may highlight a response to some internal divisions among artists in a context of tremendous collective formation in the 1980s. More specifically, the new analysts perhaps also reacted against the position of some of the artists of the 85 New Ways regarding the role of the collective. The 85 New Ways corresponded to the period during which more than 2,000 artists, such as John Paley, Gu Wenda, and Wang Chun, mobilized and formed 80 unofficial groups throughout the country, such as the Cham and Dada. Among them, some wished to unify the avant-garde into a cohesive and organized movement to modernize art. But others, such as the New Analysts, argued that united artists into a structured front was in fact instrumentalizing art and the group for a kind of social revolution. The trio then viewed the group structure as exclusively supporting their creation of art rather than constituting some sort of instrument, whatever its purpose. They perhaps also considered that this so-called exploitation of art and the group structure echoed some of the government's previous propagandist directive and ideologies, from which they wanted to distance themselves. In conclusion, through their use of the book, both the new analysts and the artists and frameworks of Do It exhibition series complicate the possible scope of instruction art. For the new analysts that resided in their production, which the book featured. This process included instruction, the final book, the implementation, and the method of inventing the instruction. By extension, the artist's vision of authorship offered a critique of the role of the collective in the art and political scene in China. In the case of Do It, however, the art seemed to exclusively reside in written instructions, which also act as scripts for future exhibition and celebrate artists as unique authors. Throughout their practice, the new analysts tried to create a rational art that differed from the pursuit of commercial success and the relationship between individual and the collective driving art in China at the time. Like the instruction-based practices of Western conceptual artists and the Do It series, the practices of the new analyst also celebrated and validated the status of instruction as an art form. For both the new analyst and Do It, the book conveyed the instruction process as significant. But while the latter proclaimed the individual artist as unique and privileged the instruction over its execution, the new analyst proclaimed the individual artist as less important than the collective one, while not privileging instruction over execution. The new analyst practice therefore complicates the scope and meaning of instruction art internationally by clearly asserting that the art in this genre lies in the entire process of production, rather than being channeled in the direction itself. In doing so, they may indirectly shed a new light on the collaboration between instructor and maker of art by instruction. Thank you. And I'm now going to hand over to Megan Williams.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Megan Williams, and today I will be presenting my thesis entitled Purple Dye in a Clear River, an analysis of the curatorial, critical, and activist practices of Adrienne Fusé from 1979 to 2000. Bay Area curator, critic, and activist Adrienne Fusé devoted her career to promoting visibility and accessibility to artists who represent a multicultural perspective to the local mainstream art world. In 1993, at a Lesbians in the Visual Arts, LVA, panel discussion, Fusé stated, "I'm an independent curator. That means I'm not attached to any institution, and that means that I don't have a steady income, so that means in actuality, the only thing that sustains me is my passion. In addition to that, what else sustains me is the support I receive from the community." Her passion in this regard led her to curate diverse art exhibitions, support queer art and activism, and write art reviews and critical texts. Although Fusé is not well known in Bay Area history, she accomplished many achievements throughout her career. She contributed to the founding of 9 grassroots organizations, leaving behind a legacy that is curiously unknown in the arts community. She was working during the 1990s, a period characterized by what has now been called the culture wars, a controversial moment when art began to open up the dialogue on race, gender, and identity. At that time, artists and social activists came together to create an increase in cultural acceptance of marginalized groups. Fusé's work often touched on these issues, and many of her projects reflect the activities of this decade. Throughout her career, Fusé strove for queer acceptance and attempted to overturn dualities, institutional hierarchies, and stereotypes of gender, sexuality, race, and ethnicity. She faced many challenges, including how to renegotiate traditionally accepted binary definitions of identity when her individual identity as a lesbian and an African American woman was fluid. Today, using materials from her archive and conversations with her colleagues, I will provide some context for her work and activity as a curator, critic, and activist to historicize her important contributions to multiple artistic communities operating in the San Francisco Bay Area during the 1990s and early 2000s. Fusé's archive at the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender (GLBT) Historical Society in San Francisco attests to her work as a curator with many artistic interests, including lesbian aesthetics, the Burning Man Project, political work, as well as social practice and technology-based projects. Fusé organized so many projects in the arts that this presentation cannot account for the entire scope of her work. Fusé was born in 1950 near the Watts Towers in Los Angeles, LA. About living there, she later recalled, "I can't begin to tell you what the value of that experience was. To be able to play in what is now an internationally known, very important artifact of naive outsider art." Her first job out of college was as director of the Artist in Residence program at the Watts Towers Arts Center. Here, she staged her first exhibition in 1979 entitled Children of Watts, First Edition, featuring the artwork of 4th, 5th, and 6th grade students. Representing Fusé's primary encounter with art as a child, Watts was the beginning of her career curating and bringing together art, the African American community, and outsiders. This early curatorial project set forth an important theme in Fusé's career for championing underrepresented artists. In 1983, Fusé moved from LA to San Francisco, and here she met Ann Meisner, director of the Art Commission Gallery, who nominated her to the San Francisco Gallery Advisory Board. There, she became president in 1988 and was a board member until 1992. Shortly after beginning this position, Fusé curated her first show in San Francisco at Somarts entitled Torch and Anvil. This was an exhibition of metalwork that highlighted developments and trends in the local arts community. The exhibition featured the metalworking medium and brought attention to 20 local and emerging artists, craftsmen, and metalworkers, as well as educational opportunities for community participants. One might argue that this show's presentation of craft-based and outsider work represents an early interest by Fusé in connecting with the local community and exhibiting works that fall outside of the fine art paradigm. In 1990, Fusé and the San Francisco-based photographer Happy L.A. Hyder co-founded the LVA. Their goal with the LVA was to increase the visibility of lesbian arts professionals through visual activism, networking, education, and members with attention toward multiculturalism. And in 1998, Fusé juried an LVA show at Somarts entitled Public-Private, which displayed the work of 44 women. Unlike other exhibitions taking place at the same time, such as SF State, Kill Me, Eat Me, Love Me, Scott O'Hara, Portraits, Nudes, and Hard Dick Images, or Les Petites Morts, The Little Death, artworks and altars on the themes of sex, orgasm, and death, which dealt with queer aesthetics but were engrossed in images of the body, bodily fluids, disease, the AIDS epidemic, and overt sexuality, Public-Private took a much more subtle approach that encompassed many facets of identity expression. For instance, Happy Hyder's piece, Accepting Their Fears as Valid, ellipses, which evokes themes of privacy, isolation, invisible walls, otherness, and communication. Her installation included a journal for visitors to write about their stories and experiences. According to Hyder, there was a myriad of responses, many unrelated to lesbians. She recalls one woman's account of, quote, marrying a Japanese man and her mother not wanting some relatives to know, end quote. Accepting Their Fears as Valid cast a wide net, giving thought to what it means to be a lesbian while also exploring other identities, interests, backgrounds, and experiences not exclusively based on gender or sexuality. Thus, in Public-Private, Fusé puts into conversation topics from within the lesbian and queer community, as well as themes and concerns that a larger community, gay or straight, might access. Perhaps here we see a further iteration of Fusé's curatorial ambitions to involve many communities at once. As Fusé became more recognized for her style of curating, she decided to brand her freelance curatorial practice Gallery Fusé. Unlike a traditional gallery with a fixed location, Gallery Fusé consisted of a pop-up format, borrowing space wherever possible. It took the form of a conceptual platform in different satellite locations to show work of under-recognized artists such as Eleanor Kent, Carolyn Cole, and Jana Waldinger. In a relational sense, it is perhaps not surprising that Fusé chose to curate through her relationships in the community to galleries, nonprofits, or alternative spaces. It is understandable that her personal, layered identity influenced her not to stay in one institutional space with static identity. Nonetheless, this placelessness was somewhat a necessary condition due to her lack of funds. However, Fusé's collaborator, Hyder, claims that this format was also a purposeful decision made by Fusé. Since she had no funds, she found free space and made her exhibitions happen with minimal public and private financial support. Fusé renounced seeking grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, NEA, and other organizations and foundations, as she felt any funds received from them would make her practice vulnerable to censorship. A valid concern during the 1990s when arts organizations receiving federal funding, such as Cincinnati's Center for Contemporary Arts, which showed Mapplethorpe's The Perfect Moment, an exhibition that included homoerotic and sadomasochistic photographs, and the Brooklyn Museum, which exhibited Sensation, including Andres Serrano's infamous Piss Christ and Chris O'Feely's The Holy Virgin Mary, came under fire from government censors and conservative religious and social leaders, among others. Within this context, it was perhaps a forward-thinking decision by Fusé to organize a flexible situation for her practice, which allowed more freedom to present progressive programming. Under these conditions, it is not surprising, perhaps, that Fusé seemed to enjoy the curatorial freedom she found at the Burning Man Festival, a festival which started in 1986 on Baker Beach in San Francisco with the effigy of a wooden man and later moved to the Black Rock Desert, Nevada. Fusé's first curatorial project there was part of Desert Siteworks, a lesser-known precursor to Burning Man. From this experience curating in the Black Rock Desert, Fusé gained the tools and experience to bring these outside environments into the Arts Commission's gallery, SOMARTS, for an exhibition that was similar to Desert Siteworks, entitled Primal Edge. In 1994, Fusé curated Primal Edge with Burning Man founder Larry Harvey at the SOMARTS gallery. This is a sketch by the artist Suzanne Couture of her installation at SOMARTS, which took the form of a teepee structure that stood over 9 feet tall in the center of the gallery. For this exhibition, Fusé brought in more than 35 diverse artists, some who had never shown their art outside of Burning Man. She also included as many live components from the festival as possible, including the actual full-scale man, performers, fire dancers, a reliquary, dust from the desert, a functional yurt for performances, outdoor installations and lighting, and thunderstorm sound effects. The records of these early grassroots-based efforts are largely undocumented. The Burning Man website leaves out Fusé's significant contribution to the event through her role as project organizer and curator. In addition, images, video, and textual documentation of Fusé's work on the urban shows are missing from the essays and photographs on SOMART's website. Burning Man was and continues to be a place for artistic experimentation. However, its remote location resists mainstream attention, particularly during its early years. Fusé brought visibility to an art event that mainstream art circuits might consider alien or unknown, but she left a lasting impact on the development and recognition of the Burning Man Festival. In 2000, Fusé organized her final queer-themed exhibition during her role as exhibitions coordinator at the GLBT Historical Society. Prior to the Historical Society opening its physical building in 2012, the organization supported pop-up exhibitions around San Francisco. In 2000, 3 years prior to her untimely death, Fusé curated Sheets in the Wind, the poster in the San Francisco GLBT community, at the main branch of the San Francisco Public Library. The exhibition featured posters and flyers which chronicled queer community events and public life in San Francisco from the mid-1960s through the millennium. By showing primary source ephemera from an important moment during the gay liberation movement in San Francisco, Sheets in the Wind represented an iconic end to her career as a community-based curator. It took someone like Fusé with a passion for both activism and art, which fostered an intersection between and promoted socially and politically engaged work before it was coined, quote, social practice, to make strides toward creating community centers and facilitating dialogue to promote free expression of lesbian art and identity. She did this through her work with 9 nonprofit organizations that you can see here, And arguably, Fusé's most significant activist contribution and legacy to the community was to help overturn the monolithic San Francisco arts funding structure, the Hotel Tax Fund for the Arts. To accomplish this feat, Fusé and a group of 9 friends started the San Francisco Center for Lesbian, Gay, Bi, and Transgender Art and Culture, later renamed the Queer Cultural Center, QCC. The founders of the Cultural Center united with other cultural centers as part of a community response to the city of San Francisco's inequalities in the distribution of the hotel tax funds for the arts. In 1997, these organizations united as the Consortium of San Francisco Community Cultural Centers. The same year, they were gifted hotel tax funds to fulfill their visions. Fusé was essential to the development of this Bay Area institution, which continues to support multicultural queer artists today. Fusé was a talented orator and writer. She wrote critical art texts for 551 and Vox magazine, among others. And her archive is also interspersed with handwritten poetry. This piece of her writing was intended as a call to action for artists to submit work for an LVA exhibition entitled Purple Dye in a Clear River. For logistical reasons, the show never took place, but the first paragraph in the text poetically reads, "Pure light holds all colors. Adding the purple dye of art made by lesbians to the clear river of mainstream art represents a major transformation in our visibility and accessibility to the mainstream art world. Adding the purple dye means adding our multicultural lesbian perspective in complement with other colored dyes and cultural perspectives." This passage illustrates Fusé's vision to elevate and empower the careers of marginalized artists, to build more mainstream awareness of their work and recognize under-celebrated communities. She challenged her communities to explore their identities and political views through art, while resisting oversimplifying queer or lesbian aesthetics and African American and/or women artist identities. By diverging from myopic representations of identity, her work allowed for a deeper understanding and acceptance of difference, particularly at a time when many curators viewed diversity through a narrow scope. She created the conceptual platform Gallery Fusé for her curatorial projects, showcasing an array of artists, and her activism and advocacy for Bay Area artists created a framework for queer and multicultural grassroots organizations to flourish into the future. Fusé strongly believed, "We exist in a time of awakening consciousness. Groups that have been previously silenced are emerging with very strong voices to challenge the assumptions society has placed on all of us." Fusé was one of these emerging voices, and her curatorial work challenged assumptions on race, gender, sexuality, and activism. The lessons and morals she stood for continue to resonate in the arts today. She was a visionary curator who, with a few drops of purple dye, could turn a river lavender. Thank you very much. And I would also like to quickly thank the many people who have helped me with this project and helped me delve into the world of Adrienne Fusé, including Nancy Frank, Margaret Tedesco, E.G. Crichton, Rudy Limp, Vincent Potter, Kim Ono, and especially Happy Hyder and Maureen Martin for loaning me their personal archives. I couldn't have done it without them. In addition, I would like to thank my advisors, Lisa Dent, Christina Podesva, and Lee Markopoulos. Finally, I'd like to thank my family and friends for their support. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you stay awake. My name is Marion Cousin, and today I'm going to present my thesis entitled The Fabrication of Truth. I just want to quickly thank my advisors, Christina, Lee, and Erica, and also my friends. for their work and support. And I just want to say that these 2 years have been amazing, and thanks to my fellow classmates. Guys, it's been good, and it's because of you. Thank you. So my thesis is based on the study of 2 video works, Hostage the Bashar Tapes by the Atlas Group and The Casting by Omar Fast. It explores how the 2 artists blur the boundary between fact and fiction to address the media representation of Middle Eastern conflicts. I'm going to start my presentation by showing a 2-minute clip from Hostage. At the beginning of this tape, which is tape 17, a short text introduces the project, followed by the sound of a man's voice, Suhail Bashar, introducing himself and giving instructions on how to show his video. The clip you're about to see starts with a blue background, as Bashar requested, blue like the Mediterranean. It's not working. And it's not working. Sorry about that.
Yes, our story is tragic. Yes, it is sordid. But you have to remember that it is first and foremost a story. And in this way, it is familiar to you. I was held for 27 weeks in the same cell with 5 Americans. We ate, slept, talked, played, and cried together. There isn't much that one can hide in a small room with 5 anxious men. Our routine was the same every day for 27 weeks. Nothing changed. After our release, each of the Americans wrote a book, and each book was published. In the 1990s, 5 books written by 5 men who were held in the same 10 by 12-foot room have been published. Why? Why was this story told 5 times? Why were 5 different versions of it published? Because the story is not the same. Or as the hostages like to say, each man experiences captivity in his own way. No doubt this is true. True not only of the experience of captivity, but of all experiences today. But there is more. I remember asking Terry,
For a brief
David,
period in the
Ben,
summer of
Marty,
1985,
and Tom,
6
about
men
how
were
they
held
felt.
together in the same 10 by 12-foot room in the basement of a building somewhere in the southern suburbs of Beirut, close to the airport.
This clip is part of Hostage, the Bashar Tapes, produced in 2001 by the Atlas Group, a project run by Lebanese artist Walid Rad. For this work, Walid Rad invented the fictional character of Suhail Bashar, imagined to be an Arab hostage during the Western hostage crisis, a series of kidnappings during the Lebanese Civil War in the 1980s. Bashar claims to have produced 53 videotapes that treat with his 10-year captivity. He only made tapes 17 and 31 available outside of Lebanon. In tape 17, Bashar focuses on a specific 3-month period when he was detained with 5 other Americans in the 10 by 12-foot cell. In addition to Bashar's testimony facing the camera, Rad added archival material such as images or sound from the news reports at the time of the Western hostage crisis. However, Rad introduced some elements that subtly disturb the accuracy of the depicted events. Later in Bashar's confession, the interlacing of the two narrative voices, him talking in Arabic and the English translator, creates tensions and contradictions in the account of the episode. Bashar recalls the memory of one other American hostage trying to penetrate him. At this specific moment, the English voiceover presents him as the victim, whereas in the Arabic accounts of the event, the roles of the assaulter and the victim are inverted. Viewers are thus left wondering which voice tells the truth. New York-based artist Walid Rad released Hostage right after the terrorist events of September 11, 2001, which announced a decade of images and narratives in Western media depicting the Middle East exclusively through the lens of violence and perpetual internal wars. Starting in late 2010, the Middle East and North African regions have undergone a series of protests that have been shared and followed online with the rest of the world. In December 2010, the first civil protests occurred in Tunisia, where thousands of people took to the streets for the resignation of former President Ben Ali. This revolution led to a series of demonstrations and revolts by citizens from several other countries in the Middle East and North African region, a period that is known today as the Arab Spring. And the image that you see on the screen is the today famous Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt, when the revolution started in February 2011. Since the late 1990s, Walid Rad has received international recognition from the art world and has exhibited his works both locally and internationally at Documenta 11 in Kassel, Germany, the Venice Biennale in Italy, and the Whitney Biennial in New York City, amongst other institutions. Non-Arabic speaking audiences in these international venues may not have been able to fully identify these nuances in the narration. What are then the roles of these discrepancies in Hostage? Who are these disturbances addressed to and why? In this context, one might wonder what the significance of Hostage after the events of September 11th was. Was Rad's strategy legible for an English-speaking audience that has heard and mainly knows Middle Eastern countries through historical conflicts and traumatic events? And what is its resonance today, considering that this region has been through ongoing revolutions in the past couple of years? In order to answer these questions, I will explore how Rad uses the documentary genre, as well as communication techniques used by broadcasting programs, to offer a critique of the power of the media in crafting this fabricated representation of the Middle East. I will then consider how the artwork's conceptual frameworks of working primarily with video allows for this discussion on the representation of the region for international non-Arabic speaking audiences. Throughout this analysis, I will study Hostage in parallel with more recent 4-channel video installation, The Casting, from 2007, by Omer Fast, Israeli artist based in Berlin, Germany. For this work, Fast interviewed a US Army soldier who speaks about 2 personal events from his life: a traumatic wartime shooting in Iraq and a disturbing romantic relationship with a German woman. With Hostage, Rad created a space in which fiction has become facts and facts have become fiction by juggling with 2 elements: the performance of Fadi Samra, who plays Bashar, and footage from archives, as well as sound recordings. Alongside Bashar's stage statements, Rad inserted clips for American hostage videos from the 80s. By pairing excerpts from Hostage's Terry Anderson and David Jacobson's official appeals with images of former US President Ronald Reagan and Marine Officer Oliver North, who were all involved and represent the Western hostage crisis, Rad gives a historical credence to Bashar's kidnapping narrative. Rad added the images of these figures in the background after the newscast announces the names and position of the hostages. Rad uses archival materials to question the common validation of the veracity of the features footage, such as interviews with witnesses telling their personal accounts of the events, or the literature written about some historical episodes. So this image refers to the clip you saw at the beginning when the voiceover announces the 5 American hostages, a cover of the books that they each wrote appear on the screen. He uses editing techniques such as cross-cutting, montage, or voiceover in order to create ambiguity between the reenactment and archival material. In addition to including non-fictional imagery to complicate the video, Rad creates distortions such as glitches, flashing, or freeze frames in order to make the stage video seem as authentic as the found clips. The medium of video and its provided characteristics also play an important role in the fabrication of Cantu's stories in the casting. When viewers watch the 2-channel video on the front side of the installation, images show actors standing still, enacting the soldiers' 2 stories that's fast, interwoven through editing. These reenactments go along with the soundtrack of the interviews revealed on the backside, which serves as a voiceover for the reenactments. The other 2-channel video on the backside of the installation that you see now on the screen show 2 men having a conversation. One is the American soldier Ron Cantu telling his story on the left here, and the other is the artist Omar Fass interviewing him on the right here. The backside of the installation shows how the piece was constructed. Fass edited the interview in such a way that the boundary between the 2 stories becomes so blurry that they converge into a single, continuous narration. He worked from the soundtrack of the 2 different stories and intercut short sections from one story into the other in order to create a continuous voiceover. The reenactments follow the new narration, or script, and alternate from one place to another. Fass wove 2 stories together to produce a combination that swings back and forth in time, place, and feeling. The artist addresses the Hollywood film industry in using several elements that evoke it. He chose California to shoot his reenactment and introduces many Hollywood-style special effects to an absurd effect. Based on documented verbal facts, he recreated the real by staging the surgeon's stories as a series of silent tableaux performed by actors and filmed mainly in California, with the imaginary based on Google email search. He also added elements that are totally made up through the editing process. So the image that you see on the screen right now represents the scene in Iraq and was actually filmed in a desert in California. For example, in the part of the story that takes place in Germany, the soldier goes upstairs with the young woman, and as she pulls off her clothes, she reveals scars on her naked body. This scene is a complete invention of the artist, who edited 2 words, scared and cars, to create the word scars that he illustrated in the reenactment. Here again, Fass uses the medium of video and editing techniques to manipulate reality. The images on the front side of the installation function like documentation that confirms the personal account of the soldier. However, upon close examination, it becomes apparent that they are artificial. In this same scene in which the soldier is pulling the woman's clothes off, the prosthetic quality of the scars become apparent to the viewer's eyes, rendering them absurd and fake. Another example includes a scene in Iraq after an accidental shooting occurs, in which a woman is crying, covered in blood or dirt that evidently looks like makeup. These details thus become grotesque special effects. What was thought to be a photographic documentation becomes a film mise en scène. This process draws attention to inexorable lacks of faults in any form of staging of the body. It also touches on the possibility or impossibility of the contemporary staging of historical events. In order to challenge the viewer, the story needs to stay plausible. According to Carrie Lamberbeatty, quote, "Plausibility, as opposed to accuracy, is not an attribute of a story or image, but of its encounter with viewers, whose various configuration of knowledge and horizon of expectation determine whether something is plausible to them," end quote. Even though some elements are obviously made up by the artists, the carefully composed constructions do not overstep their respective stories' credibility. In the casting, the tone of the soldier's voice, laughing about what happened with the German girl, and sharing his feeling of confusion, fear, guilt, and anxiety in Iraq, emphasizes the trustworthiness of the facts. In the case of Hostage, Bashar recalls some episodes of his captivity with very specific details about what happened and what he felt at the time. Through the careful attention to create plausible yet doubtful stories and the use of documentary film's characteristics, Walid Rad with the Atlas Group and Omer Fass both construct narratives that blur fact and fiction. If Rad uses fiction to tell a story that he presents as truth, Omer Fass recreates the reality based on both fragments of memory and elements based on invention. Hostage constitutes a false evidence rather than documentary evidence, but still aspire to tell the viewers something about the history of the conflict in Lebanon, as well as America's role in that conflict that tends towards the truth. Furthermore, through this blurry line between fact and fiction, Rad and Fass draw attention to the status and authority of the depicted information and challenge its manipulation by the media in representation of war and the role of memory. Fass and Rad both invite the viewers to question their own biased representation of Middle East events using confusing details and their relationship to the depicted traumatic events conveyed by the media they report. However, both makers leave different marks on their videos and challenge the audience's roles in different ways. Rad is subtle, and one can completely believe in the scenario he invents, while Fass gives the clue of a constructed story by starting with the question, "So, what do you feel about improvising?" Construction later revealed when the viewers see the back part of his installation. Both artists challenge their viewers in playing with both the expectations about reality of images and the stereotypes of the Middle East wars. They use their relationship to the media, and more specifically what they give us to see. More than presenting an objective view of a general belief, they challenge the viewers in making them question who and what information they can trust. The artists make their viewers think about the nature of the images they are seeing on television, images that are supposedly true. Rad and Fass both use the medium of video as a psychological tool to confront issues of memory and trauma in relation to the experience of war. Further than questioning the goal of reenacting war scenes or episodes of captivity, one can wonder what the consequences of such representation can be. Do these two works ambition to resolve anything? Are there any successful way to capture what war is? What do the visual factors the artists use communicate to the viewers? What question do they both raise in using these different strategies? More than challenging the viewers, in Hostage and the casting, Rad and Fass create confusions on the audience. Through their respective use of confusion, they invite their viewers to be critical and question what they see in front of them. In different ways, they are each playing with the boundary between reality and fiction, and how reality can become fiction, a construction, through language, memory, and subjectivity. The reenactments adds a dramatic intensity to the stories, but do not reduce the truthfulness the videos claim. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's been a long day for a lot of us, but we've reached our last presentation. My name is Lauren O'Connell, and I'll be presenting my thesis entitled David Ireland's 500 Cap Street, Making Visible a Complex Matrix of Relationships. Before I begin, I'd like to do a quick thanks to 500 Cap Street Foundation, specifically Carly Wilmans and Jessica Rue, who opened up for providing access to David Ireland's archive, images, and house. Without your support, this thesis would never have been possible. I'd also like to thank Tony Labatt, who knew David Ireland and spoke to me about his own experience at 500 Cap Street. From late 1976 until close to his death in 2009, the San Francisco-based artist David Ireland used his home at 500 Cap Street to act out his artistic philosophy of revealing everyday, ephemeral moments in overlooked spaces. After years of traveling, school, and an assortment of professions, Ireland purchased this Victorian house on the corner of Cap and 20th Streets in San Francisco's Mission District. The house had undergone little structural change since its construction in 1886, and it survived fire on 3 sides as well as the 1906 earthquake, sustaining only the marks and remnants of former tenants. This is a picture of 500 Cap Street taken in 1983, which more or less looks the same today. And this is the earliest known picture of the house, dated circa 1886. While Ireland's house is widely acknowledged, it is often overshadowed by his sculptural objects, which tend to have more exposure in exhibitions due to their transportability. Today, we will look at Ireland's artistic process vis-a-vis the house to critically examine the role of 500 Cap Street within his overall practice. It is my strong belief that the house, rather than being an idiosyncratic and peripheral activity, is central to Ireland's practice, and that it offered a platform for an extensive system involving the artistic concerns of process, performance, and materials. This system serves as an index of the artist's interaction with his house and is characterized by an ongoing symbiotic relationship between the architecture of this home and the events that played out within it. I propose that the series of activities Ireland undertook within 500 Cap Street fall into 3 categories of maintenance, preservation, and index of site. These processes are sequential. First, the performative act of cleaning the house precedes the second of stabilizing the original surfaces, and the third of exhibiting sculptural objects and installation projects which refer to the relationship between the house and the artist. Maintenance action is the term Ireland used to categorize his house at 500 Cap Street, about which he has said, quote, "It was not my intention to make an artwork out of the house. I'm just cleaning house. I call it a maintenance action. I sort of think of it as performance, installation, kind of all the different art forms," end quote. The word maintenance and the act of cleaning echo the work and ideas of Merrill Latterman Euclides, who became famous for cleaning performances such as this one shown here, entitled Washing Tracks Maintenance Outside, where she washed the front steps of the Wadsworth Athenaeum in 1973. According to critic and historian Jorge Otero Pelos, this work illustrated, quote, "the cultural stigma associated with cleaning," end quote. In Euclid's formative essay, Manifesto for Maintenance Art, 1969, she defines maintenance alongside development as follows. Quote, "Development, pure individual creation, the new, change, progress, advance, excitement, flight or fleeing. Maintenance, keep the dust off the pure individual creation, preserve the new, sustain the change, protect progress, defend and prolong the advance, renew the excitement, repeat the flight." Ireland originally planned to tear down the interior walls of 500 Cap Street to create an open space for his studio. But after spending time in the house, he instead chose to clean it and, quote, "renew the excitement," end quote, of what was already there through maintenance actions. And Ireland set to his tasks throughout the house, one after another, removing wallpaper, paint, and baseboards, sanding walls and ceiling, dusting, sweeping, vacuuming, stripping the floor, scrubbing with soap and water, and washing windows. While these tasks took place in a domestic environment where labor is generally associated with housework and the female homemaker, Ireland's labor implies the masculine role of the handyman, where laborious tasks are not repeated on a daily basis, but enacted one time with a transformative end result. However, Ireland's maintenance actions imply ongoing activities and are not completely separate from acts of housework. Following the extensive cleaning that Ireland performed throughout the house, he coated the majority of its surfaces with several layers of urethane. Ireland describes this process in the house as a, quote, a kind of stabilization, a kind of holding it and freezing it in place, end quote, indicating a preservation of his findings as well as the second phase within his maintenance actions. In this image taken on the second level, shortly after the completion of Ireland's preservation process, the room glows with its freshly coated walls. Ireland recalls the luster of the surfaces. Quote, one of the wonderful things about the second level rooms is that they reflect what is going on outside. A car goes by and it gives a big red streak on the wall, and a blue one goes by and I get a blue streak, end quote. Even today, over 30 years later, the walls, ceiling, and floor on the second level reflect light that enters through the tall windows, bouncing with each movement on the street or in the sky. Different than covering the surfaces in an opaque paint, the thick film of sealant left a shiny, translucent yellow finish, appearing to seal the cracks, water damage, and blemishes without hiding them. Ireland's interventions were a gesture towards preserving the evidence of lived moments, both his own and past residents, as well as the effects of time on the built environment. For example, Ireland helped Mr. Grube, the house's previous owner, lower a safe down the stairs, making 2 dents in the wall, one on the stairway landing and the other in the front hallway. Ireland did not repair the damage, but instead acknowledged the event by marking the spots with plaques that read, "The safe gets away for the first time November 5th, 1975. And the safe gets away for the second time November 5th, 1975. These acts of preservation do not follow the guidelines of professional conservators, but they do convey the underlying notion that preservation is an indication of time. Patrick Sission, a specialist in historic preservation, explains that, quote, preservation offers a critical historical view of an object in space and time, but paradoxically, by only full recognition of the absences in both physical and temporal records. Time here does not necessarily mean the linear phenomenon we experience, but rather the incomplete record of time deposited in the built environment, end quote. This quote suggests that preservation cannot recount every event of an object's life, such as the house, but instead observes the marks of lived events on the building to achieve some glimpse of what it has endured. Ireland's maintenance of 500 Cap Street reflects his own evolution as an artist, as well as his labors of art making itself. Ireland recalls that, quote, slowly, I progressed as an artist, and I reached a philosophical point where I realized that the lively presence I was looking for was here on the walls as I stripped away and cleaned off the surfaces, end quote. The actions within the house were not purely self-reflexive, nor independent from the events happening around him in late 1970s San Francisco. In 1978, the same year that Ireland finished the majority of his maintenance actions, Optic Nerve and Charles Bolton made Push Out for Profit, a documentary about the rise in evictions and rent due to real estate speculation in the Mission District. Perhaps Ireland's interventions were a tacit acknowledgement of gentrification due to his unorthodox renovation of the house during the height of the eviction crisis. However, it seems to be a rather different gesture than that of activism, taking on instead an attitude much more like a Duchampian ready-made, which can be defined as a common mass-produced object found or purchased by the artist. If Ireland's house is a sort of ready-made, rendering it unusable in some respects to the house flipping antics of developers, then it becomes a statement within the socio-cultural context of gentrification and evictions in San Francisco in the late 1970s. However, Duchamp's ready-mades, which require very little work by the artist in order to be realized, if any at all, differ very significantly from Ireland's house activities, in that the latter were created through the artist's ongoing and intensive labor. In her book, Work Ethic, Ireland intentionally documented his maintenance and preservation actions by inviting Steve Kafetz to photograph them and Tony Labat to videotape these activities, which took place over an entire year. In conversations with Labat, Ireland would establish his tasks before executing them in front of the camera. In these images, we see Tony Labat, then an MFA student at the San Francisco Art Institute, videotaping Ireland stripping the floor at 500 Cap Street. In her book, Work Ethic, art historian Helen Molesworth notes that in the 1960s and 1970s, quote, artists were replicating the roles of both manager and worker in the production of art, end quote. And that, quote, artists who assigned themselves tasks and then performed them rejected traditional artistic media and their attendant skills and turned instead to a presentation of the work of art in the language of a thing done, a task performed. In doing so, many developed an obsessive reliance upon documentation, end quote. In view of Molesworth's findings, it is logical to think of Ireland's maintenance action as more than a process. They were instead performances involving basic labor that provoked the ontological question, what constitutes art? And if Ireland's activities were performances, they occurred in the private space of a house, prompting the question, who were they for? Or, in other words, who is the audience? It is clear that Ireland intended his performance to exist for an audience through the video and photographic documentation he organized of his task and process-based works. And in 1978, after he completed his maintenance and preservation interventions, Ireland presented the house and documentation by opening 500 Cap Street for exhibition. On the screen here, we can see a poster advertising the event. But it is worth noting that by presenting the actions to the audience secondhand, through the mediation of documentation and the house as evidence, an aspect of performance is challenged, that is, the live, in-person event, which is asserted by performance scholar Rosalie Goldberg. Perhaps we can define performance in the case of Ireland and his house as the lived event, a performance of commonplace and laborious tasks resulting in a lived experience that resonates beyond the moment of execution. Artists often use or make objects during a performance, but art historian Christine Stiles explains that the performances of, quote, 20th century artists illustrate how the artifact is only an index of art. It is not necessarily art itself, end quote. Portions of the house at 500 Cap Street, either physically or conceptually, permeate each sculptural object Ireland made, and the materials seem to fall into one of three categories: those exhumed from the house, those brought into it from other places, and those that the artist made through experiments with process and the marking of events. In the first group of objects, for example, is a jar of rubber bands that made Rubber Band Collection with Sound Accompaniment, 1977, and a collection of used brooms that made Broom Collection with Boom, 1978. Both of the sculptures were formed from objects found in the house. The components of the second group come from Ireland's personal history and include family heirlooms, souvenirs, and relics collected during his time as an African safari guide, or furniture he designed specifically for the house, which we see an example of here. The most famous of Ireland's process-based sculptures is Dunball's 1986. Made from the repetition of throwing concrete from one hand to the other until it dries into a uniform spherical shape. The artist's hand is literally represented in the finger marks imprinted in the concrete and the hand-shaped size of the balls. Ireland called his work sculpture, but his sculpture was not static. In the introduction of the 2011 exhibition Sculptural Acts, curator Patricia Dander and Julian Lors write, quote, "While sculpture is ordinarily associated with a state of stasis, the act suggests movement or an action of some sort. The premise here is that the acts involved in making sculpture, processes that are not usually presented or visible to the viewer, but which are, nevertheless, inscribed in the way materials are used," end quote. In this way, Ireland's action of throwing the dumbbells is equal, if not more significant, to the residual object. In a series of images of a room or a wall in Ireland's house, taken during different periods of time, one can see that the objects do not stay in one place inside of the house. At times, the main rooms on the second level appear minimally inhabited by people or objects, while at other times, objects clutter the space. Moving furniture, sculptures, and wall hangings within the house became another one of Ireland's performative processes, creating a place where time is simultaneously frozen in the walls, floor, and ceiling, and while being very changeable and dynamic within the space of the rooms. Exhibiting nationally and internationally, Ireland distributed the objects as indexical references to the site of his house. In the essay, Notes on the Index, art historian Rosalind Krauss explains the index in relation to 1970s art in America. Quote, "As distinct from symbols, indexes establish their meaning along the axis of a physical relationship to the reference. They are the marks or traces of a particular cause, and that cause is the thing to which they refer, the object they signify," end quote. The cause in the case of Ireland's practice was the relationship, built from labor and observation, between the artist, his house, and the objects. The material artifacts, often referred to as sculpture, do not only leave the house in a singular direction for the exhibitions, but also return symbolically and physically to the site of 500 Cap Street, serving as, quote, "a matrix for a related set of ideas which connect to one another through the axis of the index," end quote. In conclusion, Ireland's artworks, either sculptural or performative, all of which I did not have time to present today, rotate around the axis of his house, which is a repository for provisional materials and a site for artistic production. By acknowledging the tasks he undertook within the house as equal to the objects that resulted, and recognizing that the objects themselves are not independent of the place and person who made them, then 500 Cap Street would appear to take a more critical role in Ireland's practice. The house, a stationary object, acts as the connective source for Ireland's work, and by this extends beyond the physical site to make visible a complex matrix of relationships. Thank you.
Thank you. The all-female session and the final session. Wow, lots to process here, but thank you all for your presentations. One of the things that I was thinking about while listening to you was sort of the importance of framing and how we understand artistic or curatorial practice through the frames by which we encounter them. So I think this applies to all four of your presentations. And I think you showed us different ways of framing and a way of sort of accessing the works or the curatorial projects in a way that helps us think differently about what we might understand or have understood about some of these projects. So from there, I'd like to go specifically, I want to talk especially to Marie and Lauren about something, because you both touched on a question that is very dear to me, which is sort of the ontological question. What is the art? Where does the art lie? You both actually engaged this question in your presentations. And I think what was fascinating to me is that the word instruction came up as the problematic that Marie is trying to work through. Where is the art in art by instruction? And that in Lauren, in your case, there were many words, but another one that came up for me was index. So, the index points somewhere, and the instruction also points somewhere. So I was thinking a lot about directionality of where is the art, where's the source of the art, who is the audience, who is the artist, etc. So these two presentations definitely spoke to one another around this ontological question. So I know you did get into it, you both got into it in your presentations, but I'd like you to speak a little bit more about it because it seems like a very rich question, one that probably scratched your heads over quite a bit, and so maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about it, I think it would be useful.
Well, I can't necessarily, well, I guess I should say that sometimes the easiest thing to do is to pinpoint and say, this is art, and actually identify it. But oftentimes in 20th century artists and contemporary artists of our time, there's not necessarily one object or one action or one medium that can be pointed to, which I talked about a little bit I talked about in my thesis and a little bit in my presentation. So in terms of the index, and through all of my research in the archive, what really, at first I was looking at the house as just an art object itself or a medium for art, but I realized that it became more based on this series of relationships that the artist had in the house and discovering information about past residents and using these objects to kind of tell this story in a very simple way or non-direct manner all the time. So I guess what's interesting for me as well is that I wouldn't classify David Ireland as only a sculptor, nor a conceptual artist, nor an installation artist, nor a site-specific artist, because his practice is really unique to himself, and yet at the same time rings true for a lot of contemporary artists today as well. I don't think it's too far offline from what some other people are doing in different ways with their own practice. So.
Yeah, and I think for those of you who don't know, from what I understand, the way you've approached his practice through the lens of his house, let's say, really changes the way we understand him as an artist, because normally you say his house is kind of seen separately from his practice, but you're saying it's actually
it's
more
not separate, it's always acknowledged.
It's acknowledged.
People know that it's an extremely important part of his practice. But like I said, oftentimes the sculptural elements or the installation works are most often recognized because they're able to go out and be exhibited. So something like a house, which is very stuck in place, I mean, it is itself a structure for exhibition. It's just harder to, it took me a really long time to actually parse through all of this. So it's not so easily understood, I don't think.
Yeah, and there was a project that you weren't able to talk about in this presentation for the Los Angeles, for LACMA, right? Maybe you could talk about that real quick.
Sure. Well, okay. I don't have my notes in front of me, but I believe it was around 1988. David Ireland proposed an installation for the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art, in which, in the sketches at least, which 500 Cap Street provided, the walls are painted yellow or a yellowish color, and there's a pile of dirt in the middle, which according to the notes would have been excavated from the basement at 500 Cap Street. So in looking at it, to somebody who doesn't know Ireland's practice, coming into a space like the White Cube, which has perfect walls that have all of a sudden been turned yellow in a pile of dirt, it might be really hard to understand. Whereas if you go to the Headlands and see his installation or work there, I feel like what happened there is that it is an old building, and so David then took his own processes that he worked or did in the house and reenacted them at the Headlands. So I think one of the things you're referring to is we were talking about this idea that oftentimes people don't consider the architectural elements or conditions of exhibition spaces. So in this case, those architectural elements are really do affect the way that Ireland is able to communicate his practice or maybe his reference back to the house.
Marie, do you have anything to add?
I think it goes with what you were saying also, Lauren. To me, your question about framework, and when you ask a question, where is the art in, for instance, art by instruction, for me was very important through my research, specifically because for Chinese contemporary art, especially in the beginning of the 1990s, there are so few writings about it that it's really hard to actually find evidences or just, writings or even talking to people that might say different things about the same specific event. When you think about framework, to me it seems like it's not because you see something that it will actually be the case. So, for instance, if you think about Do It, even if, for instance, the curatorial framework, the art seems to reside in this collaborative process between the artist and the audience. When you look at the fact, actually it's not. And so it's very important to me to look closely to things, but also actually not trying to frame too much things.
Yeah, so in that case, there's also the difference between the intention behind maybe the curatorial gesture or the artistic project, and then the actual result, whatever, because as you pointed out in your presentation, they don't always match up.
Yes.
Okay, good. So let's open it up to the audience.
I have a very specific question for you, Mary. It's really a question about what exactly the resonance of the New Analyst group's collectivity was. Because of course, over the course of the 20th century, many of the projects of the avant-garde staging itself as a kind of collective, what I constantly, where my mind goes is say, suprematism. The idea of artists creating a collaborative style in which individual authorship is effaced. Or, for example, BMPT, Buren, and the rest. Or, for example, Art and Language, who Ken called up earlier. But then I think all of these were Marxists. These were Marxists. Whereas I don't quite have that same sense from the New Analysts. And so I'm curious, just what is the resonance of this collectivity that they're attempting to stage, if not a Marxist collectivity or a Maoist collectivity?
First, I think that the context of China is very specific, and it's very hard to maybe analyzing this group like this. And there in China, the concept of group had very big resonance, and specifically since the end of the Cultural Revolution and in the 1980s, as I tried to explain in the intro and in the development. And then then at the time, you have a lot of small collectives that were trying to work together, but a lot for logistical purposes. I would call it logistical, for funding exhibitions or just for possible state repression. So when this the goal of the collective started to diverge at the end of the 1980s, that's maybe when you had very big conscious about the role of the collective, which may not have been the case in the 1980s. So to me, it was very, at the beginning of the 1990s in China, individual artists were mostly looking for financial success at the time. So then it also took another aspect at the time, I think. don't know if I answer.
Thank you. Megan, I actually have a question about your research. I was curious to know if in your path this year, if you've encountered the ways in which her exhibitions were received here in San Francisco versus in Black Rock during what is the festival name? Burning Man, yeah. Just because, we talk a lot about Burning Man and its context and the types of society established there versus here, the type of rules. I was just curious, was there any backlash? Was there a high attendance to a lot of her exhibitions?
That's a great question, Patty. Finding out the audience response to any of her exhibitions was a huge challenge for me because so little of that was documented at the time. I mean, if you notice, I hardly have any installation shots or actual shots from the events. Most of them are ephemera from the archives. I have a lot of things that she hand wrote and things like this, but knowing, and I know what she thought of it maybe, but knowing what other people thought is really tricky. I just recently found the book that I mentioned with the piece with the doors with the windows, where people actually journaled their responses to that. So that was really cool. As far as Burning Man, I don't know what the response was to what she was doing actually on the Black Rock Desert in Nevada, but I do get the impression from the people that I've talked to that her urban shows here in San Francisco did heighten the visibility of the festival during its early period when not as many people knew about it or had already been to it. And I don't know for a fact, but I'd like to imagine that it maybe increased some attendance at the festival. But I don't know how you would possibly prove something like that without more documentation or information. Great question.
Are we really finished? Lee has a question.
I guess I spent a lot of time, not a lot of time, but I spent some time during the panel. I know this was sort of a difficult panel to constitute in many ways, thinking about resonances between your 4 presentations. And I think any sort of attempt to do that would be artificial, so I'm not going to do that, so I'm sorry if I leave anyone out. But it struck me there were similarities between Lauren's paper and Marie's, certainly in the way that both your artists were working performatively, or your artist group and your artists were working in sort of performative vein. And working in a performative vein, can you not hear me? It's great. Oh. Performance. So David Ireland sort of, but definitely obviously intending it as a form of performance because it was documented. It's not just a sort of solipsistic act, that like a tree falling in the forest kind of moment. He really wanted the performance to live on. And then the New Analyst group, there was a performative element to their work as well. When you two were listening to each other's presentations, did anything become clear? I'm thinking especially for you, Marie, as well, about some of the, yeah. Do you want to comment on that, maybe?
Actually, when I was listening to Lauren and thinking about process and performativity in their works, I was thinking specifically of one of the aspects of the New Analyst practice, which is that they organize events where they were actually showing, I think that's the thing, their process in exhibition venues. And actually it relates to framework because actually the archives on this group is almost non-existent. So when I was thinking about Lauren and this closed door kind of process on the artist's work, and in comparison to the new analysts, where the process is also indoor but trying to be outdoor, it gave me another perspective on their work, I think, that may be useful for the future.
Yeah, I think the main thing that I see Marie and my projects kind of talking about is this idea of establishing instructions, or whether it's instructions or a task. So for Do It, it was the artist setting instructions to have an audience member then perform it. For New Analyst Group, the collective came up with it, and then they kind of went through, and each artist took turns performing the task or instruction. And for David Ireland, he set the tasks for himself and performed them himself. So I think, to me, a lot of this idea of organization comes into it. But I'll also say that listening to Ken's presentation this morning, I definitely felt like our projects could have been presented side by side as well for similar reasons. So.
I have a question that may sort of reach out to several people who presented today, but it's actually one that's about research and the curatorial that certain practices place because the archival record, for example, focuses largely on curatorial writing and promotional materials and ephemera, or because the group of artists quite literally destroyed most of the evidence of their work, or things like this. And I'm wondering, it was just striking, just the difference between these presentations and, for example, Lauren's, where like there's such a tremendous like visual, photographic, videotape, like the documentary record of this place. I mean, the vividness with which one can grasp it just through the visual material is really striking. And so I'm just interested if you can talk a little bit about the challenges of research and writing around a topic where the archive is peculiar or lacking.
I can only speak for my own research, of course, but going through the archives of Adrienne Fusé at the GLBT Historical Society was quite a challenge in many ways, because it definitely felt like detective work at a lot of times, like sorting out, wait, there's this flyer in the archive. Did she curate this show, or she just went to it and picked up the flyer? You know, like sometimes it doesn't say. A lot of stuff didn't have dates on it. I have images without dates on it. And even reaching out to friends and colleagues of hers, I came across many instances of, just stuff that happened over 10 years ago, and the memory is a little fuzzy, and I think that it's such a difficulty not to be able to see these exhibitions. I mean, it's quite possible that the works that were even in these exhibitions aren't around anywhere. I mean, they themselves might not have survived, much less documentation. I mean, this is a challenge. Like, following on Patricia's question, like we not only don't know how people in San Francisco might have received them exactly, we don't even know what they were. There's just a deep lack of knowledge. Yeah, certainly, all the time. I wish Adrienne was here today to clarify many things for me. I would have a lot of questions.
I guess for me, it was a little bit of both. I had the material, I had the 2 videos, so it was quite easy for that part. The thing I was lacking maybe was for Omar Fast, for the casting. The installation is essential to the work, and I haven't seen it installed. And but I had the material. The big difficulty, I guess, for me was the amount of writing about the 2 artists. And it's very helpful because it's a lot of different angles, but it's very hard because what do you need to talk about now when you have all this material? And I guess the difficulty for me too, and I recall actually when we were here on Wednesday, it's how to represent the stereotypes I'm talking about, this representation of the Middle East. When I talk about 9/11, do I put an image of the towers? Or, you know, I guess it's this too much becomes very difficult, and it's actually sometimes better to lack from some of the images when you talk about something that tough in a context like this now, 10 years after the events. So yeah, it's a little bit of both.
Marion, I was hoping that you might be able to, I'm just riffing on the previous question, but I was hoping you might be able to theorize for us a little bit, since both of your artists who you discuss sort of deal with gaps in archives and missing information. If you might be able to connect that to a curatorial practice or a scholarly practice. Is there a model there that we could use?
Tough question. I don't know if I do find or identify a curator to talk about these practices. I think I see the artists as their own curators, because it's the whole works within a context of them being who they are, coming from where they come from, living where they live, and where they present the work. And it's this whole context that I don't really know how to answer this question. It's a tough question.
I guess maybe it's a question for all of you. Is there a way with these gaps in information to still make a whole truth? And obviously you think so because you made your projects this way. So maybe that's a different way to frame it.
I would say that even with the extensive amount of resources that I had available to me, there will always be, at least in my case, some missing information because I don't have the artist himself to answer my questions. And so I think in terms of a curatorial practice or exhibition making that deals with either a great gap or a small gap in information, oftentimes it's really good to rely on visual information. A lot of things that I realized about David Ireland's house was through the images of the house. So where you might not have the exact factual information, there are statements you can make based on visual information that might help fill some of those gaps.
I think for myself, what I would like to do actually is write a paper and that says one thing, and a year later write some papers that say the opposite, just because I don't want to frame specific practice. And actually, I think that I'm a bit afraid by archives because I think they're just one part of the whole story. And even if you do talk to the artist, they can say something to you once and say the complete opposite later. So there is no actual one truth. And I think even for curatorial practice, I think I would be interested to create different show on the exact same subject but presented completely differently every time.
I don't know the specific question or just going off what you just said, Joanna. I think perhaps what's interesting to me, or what I just learned from all of this, and because I was having the same as what Lee mentioned, that I'm connecting them all, but I think it might be, you asked me, can we find a curatorial practice within this? I wonder if it is the gaps where the art is found that we're talking, we're talking about where are those art moments, and I was just thinking, your title is so lovely, Marion, the fabrication of truth, and it makes me think of Leela's presentation also, she was talking about Franklin and where we create these things that are false realities, or if they're part of our reality. And I think that actually each of your presentations touched on that. And we have to riff or fill gaps in order to explain the gaps. Does that make any sense? I guess what I'm trying to say is that we create these fabrications of truth in order to be able to experience the truth in and of itself. And I think all of you maybe spoke to that a bit. And I think to me that's where many of these moments, that's where something traumatic, for example, especially in Marion's case, may happen, and then that's where the art is born from, in trying to navigate that unknown territory.
I was just going to say that maybe it's also not necessarily to fill the gaps, but to acknowledge them and ask what could have happened there.